The scorched hills surrounding Silver City shimmered like molten copper in the late August heat as Jake Miller guided his horse along the narrow trail. 5 years of working this harsh terrain as a land surveyor had taught him to read the warning signs in nature's subtle shifts. The way the wind died to an eerie stillness, how the cicadas fell silent all at once, the heavy moisture hanging in the air despite cloudless skies. Something was coming, and Jake knew better than to ignore his instincts. The dispute between the Thompson ranchers and the local Navajo had drawn him to this remote stretch of territory. Both sides claimed ancestral rights to the valley's precious water source, and the territorial governor had dispatched Jake to map the boundaries before tensions erupted into violence. But as he studied the deepening shadows in the western canyon, mapping lines seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the raw power gathering in the atmosphere. A distant rumble echoed through the rocks, too deep to be thunder. Jake reined his horse to a stop, watching in horror as a wall of debris-choked water surged around the bend ahead. The flash flood carried uprooted trees and boulders in its churning mass, and caught in its deadly current was an elderly Navajo man clinging desperately to a partially submerged log. Without hesitation, Jake spurred his mount toward a high outcropping that jutted over the flood's path. Throwing his rope with practiced precision, Jake managed to loop it around the man's chest just as the log splintered apart. The horse strained backward, muscles trembling with effort as Jake hauled the flood victim to safety. The old man collapsed on the rocks, coughing up muddy water. His weathered face was lined with exhaustion, but his dark eyes held an intensity that made Jake pause. This was no ordinary elder. There was something ancient and powerful in that penetrating gaze. "I am White Cloud," the man said, in perfect English, his voice steady despite his ordeal. "You have saved more than just an old man today, Jake Miller. You have preserved knowledge that must not be lost." Jake started to ask how the elder knew his name, but White Cloud raised a hand for silence. "The spirits spoke of your coming. They showed me your face in the sacred smoke. You are to be the new keeper of the weather songs." Jake's rational mind rebelled against such mystical claims, yet he couldn't deny the electric tension crackling through the air between them. The floodwaters continued to rage below, but atop the outcropping time seemed to stand still. White Cloud began to sing, his voice carrying impossible power despite its softness. The very wind appeared to lean in to listen as ancient syllables rolled from his tongue. To Jake's astonishment, the churning flood began to calm, its fury dissipating like morning mist in the sun. The implications of what he'd witnessed left Jake reeling. His entire worldview, built on scientific observation and careful measurement, had just been shaken to its core. Yet White Cloud's serene expression suggested this was only the beginning. The old man's next words confirmed it. "You must learn the songs before the great storm comes. Forces are gathering, more dangerous than any flood. The balance between your people and mine hangs by a thread." That night, camped beneath star-scattered skies, White Cloud began Jake's education in the weather magic. The songs were more than mere melody. They were keys that unlocked the fundamental patterns of wind and rain, drought and storm. Each phrase had to be learned exactly, for a single misplaced tone could twist the weather in unintended ways. Jake's surveyor's precision served him well as he committed the ancient knowledge to memory. Dawn found them descending into Silver City, where news of the flood had already spread. James Thompson, the wealthy rancher at the heart of the land dispute, waited with his men in front of the weather-beaten courthouse. His cold eyes narrowed at the sight of White Cloud. "Seems you survived the flood, old man. Shame. Would have simplified matters." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Jake stepped protectively between them, suddenly understanding that the coming storm White Cloud had mentioned might not be purely meteorological. The tension in town crackled like lightning ready to strike. Thompson's hired guns lounged casually along the boardwalk, hands never far from their holsters. The local Navajo gathered silently in the shadows, their stillness more unnerving than any overt threat. And through it all, Jake felt the weight of his new knowledge pressing down like storm clouds building on the horizon. He had become more than just a surveyor. He was now a keeper of ancient power, standing at the crossroads between two worlds about to collide. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across Silver City's main street as Jake made his way to the surveyor's office, his boots stirring dust that danced in the light. the leather satchel containing White Cloud's sacred weather tokens pressed against his side with each step, a constant reminder of the responsibility he'd inherited. Inside the office, his colleague William was hunched over land deed records, searching for documentation that could help resolve the escalating conflict. Thompson's claims don't add up, William muttered, spreading yellowed papers across the wooden desk. These boundaries were established decades ago, and the Navajo settlements predate any of his supposed rights to the water sources. Jake leaned over the maps, tracing the contentious border with his finger while thunder rumbled in the distance despite the cloudless sky. The door creaked open, and Sarah, the young schoolteacher who'd been helping the Navajo children learn English, entered with worry etched across her face. "They're moving cattle into the disputed territory," she reported, her voice tight with concern. "Thompson's men are driving hundreds of heads straight through the sacred grounds. The elders say it's desecrating their ancestral springs." Jake felt the tokens in his satchel grow warm, responding to his rising anger. White Cloud had warned him that the power was tied to emotion, and he forced himself to breathe slowly, remembering the elders' teachings about balance and restraint. The last thing they needed was an uncontrolled storm, born of his inexperience with the ancient magic. Outside, the tension in Silver City had grown thicker than the gathering dust. Thompson's influence reached deep into the territorial government, and Jake knew they needed more than just legal documents to protect the Navajo lands. He'd seen firsthand how the weather magic could shape the landscape, but using it would expose secrets that had been kept hidden for generations. William rolled up the maps with careful precision, securing them with leather straps. The territorial judge arrives tomorrow. Thompson's already sent his lawyer from Fort Worth, some sharp-tongued fellow named Thomas, who's won him 3 other land disputes. He paused, glancing at Jake. "We need something more than paperwork to stop this." Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "The children told me about caves in the high canyon walls, places where their ancestors recorded the history of the land and their people's connection to it. If we could find proof of their long-standing claim..." She trailed off as heavy boots sounded on the boardwalk outside. 3 of Thompson's men swaggered past the window, making a show of checking their weapons. The message was clear. Legal challenges would be met with lead if necessary. Jake touched the tokens again, feeling their energy pulse like a heartbeat. White Cloud had entrusted him with this power to protect the balance, not to wage war. But the line between defense and aggression was becoming increasingly blurred. A cool breeze swept through the office, carrying the scent of sage and desert rain. Jake made his decision. "We'll ride out at dusk," he said quietly. "Sarah, tell the elders we need a guide to those caves. William, bring whatever documents support the original boundaries." He felt the weight of their hopes settle alongside the burden of the weather magic. The sun was sinking toward the western mesas when they prepared their horses behind the livery stable. The stable boy, Samuel, worked quickly and quietly, knowing the importance of discretion. As Jake mounted up, he saw Catherine, Thompson's daughter, watching from the shadows of a nearby alley. Her presence complicated matters. She'd been teaching alongside Sarah at the school, clearly torn between loyalty to her father and her growing understanding of the Navajo's plight. The small party rode out as the first stars appeared, following a young Navajo guide along ancient paths that wound through the twisted arroyos. Jake felt the token's power growing stronger as they approached the sacred lands, the air becoming charged with more than just the electricity of an approaching storm. Tomorrow would bring either justice or conflict, and he suspected it would require both natural law and supernatural forces to protect what was right. The moonless night cloaked their small party as they followed the young guide deeper into the maze of canyons. Jake's weather sense, heightened by the ancient tokens he carried, warned of more than just the threatening storm. There was an unnatural heaviness to the air that spoke of brewing trouble. He'd learned to trust these feelings in the months since the old medicine man had passed him the sacred knowledge, even if he still struggled to fully understand its depths. The guide suddenly raised his hand, halting their progress. Ahead, Jake could make out the flicker of campfires reflecting off the red stone walls. Thompson's men had already established their position near the disputed water source, just as the Navajo scouts had reported. The cattle baron was wasting no time in his bid to seize control of this vital spring, regardless of its sacred significance, or the territorial agreements that protected native lands. Sarah shifted uneasily in her saddle beside him, her face tight with worry in the starlight. As the schoolteacher, She'd been instrumental in helping Jake bridge the cultural divide, teaching him the Navajo language and customs that made his unusual role possible. Jake Thompson gazed across the windswept plain toward the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, feeling the ancient turquoise pendant pulse against his chest. Ever since rescuing the Navajo elder Samuel from the flash flood 3 months ago, his life had transformed in ways he never could have imagined. The old man's gift of weather magic came with responsibilities Jake was still struggling to understand, especially now that land disputes were threatening to tear the border territory apart. William Davis's cattle operation had been pushing aggressively into the contested valleys near Silver City, claiming water rights that had sustained 3 different communities for generations. Jake could feel the brewing storm mirroring the tension between the settlers, ranchers, and native peoples. The pendant grew warm whenever weather changes portended conflict, and lately it hadn't cooled at all. Sarah Miller, the local schoolteacher, was one of the few who knew Jake's secret. She had witnessed him calming a destructive windstorm that nearly demolished the schoolhouse last month. Since then, she'd been helping him document the strange weather patterns and their connection to the escalating territory disputes. Her scientific mind balanced his more intuitive approach to the ancient magic. The situation grew more complex with the arrival of James Wilson, a smooth-talking businessman from Tombstone who claimed to represent Eastern mining interests. Jake didn't trust the way Wilson's eyes lingered on his pendant during their brief encounter at the Silver City Saloon. The man asked too many questions about local weather patterns and seemed far too interested in the old Navajo settlements in the area. Catherine Davis, William's wife, visited Jake's modest homestead one evening with an unusual proposal. She revealed that her husband's aggressive expansion was driven by fear. Their cattle operation was failing due to increasingly erratic weather patterns. She offered Jake a partnership, not knowing his true abilities, hoping his reputation for predicting storms could save their ranch. The irony wasn't lost on him. Thomas Johnson, the local marshal, found himself caught between competing interests as violence flared. 3 separate range wars had sparked in as many weeks, each coinciding with devastating weather events. Jake knew they weren't natural occurrences. He could feel the magic responding to the hatred and fear spreading through the territory. But revealing his power would make him a target from all sides. Samuel's teachings echoed in Jake's mind as he wrestled with his role in the growing crisis. The old man had warned him that weather magic wasn't meant for personal gain or taking sides in human disputes. Its purpose was maintaining harmony between the land and its people. Yet Jake couldn't stand idle while families lost their homes to suspicious storms that seemed to target specific properties. Elizabeth Wilson, James's sister, arrived from Fort Worth with documents suggesting their family had historical claims to key water sources in the territory. Her presence complicated Jake's investigations, especially after she began experiencing mysterious dreams about storms and ancient rituals. The pendant reacted strongly whenever she was near, suggesting she might have latent magical abilities of her own. The turning point came during a tense town meeting in Silver City's courthouse. As William Davis and James Wilson nearly came to blows over competing land claims, Jake felt the pendant burning against his skin. A massive dust storm materialized seemingly from nowhere, trapping everyone inside. In that forced confinement, old enemies began sharing stories of their struggles, finding common ground in their shared challenges against the harsh territory. Mary Thompson, Jake's younger sister, discovered historical records suggesting the weather patterns had played a crucial role in previous land disputes. The documents described how ancient peoples had used storms to protect sacred sites and maintain boundaries between different groups. Jake realized the magic wasn't just about controlling weather, it was about bringing balance to human relationships with the land itself. As autumn approached, Jake faced a critical decision. William Davis's men were planning to dam a crucial creek, which would redirect water from both native lands and smaller farms. James Wilson's mining operation was preparing to begin excavations near sacred caves. The pendant's power grew stronger each day, but using it to intervene directly would violate Samuel's teachings about the proper use of weather magic. Sarah's research revealed that similar conflicts had occurred in the region every generation, each time accompanied by severe weather events. The pattern suggested the magic itself was a guardian of the land, working through chosen individuals to prevent any one group from gaining too much control. Jake began to understand that his role wasn't to choose sides, but to help all parties recognize their connection to the territory they shared. Through careful observation, Jake noticed that the weather responded not just to his conscious control, but to the collective emotions and intentions of the people. When communities worked together, gentle rains brought abundance to everyone's lands. When greed and fear dominated, destructive storms followed. The magic was teaching him, and through him the territory's inhabitants, about the true meaning of stewardship. The pendant's mysteries continued to unfold as Jake learned to listen more carefully to both the weather and the people caught in the territorial disputes. Each storm carried messages. Each calm spell offered opportunities for dialogue. The ancient magic wasn't just a tool for controlling nature. It was a bridge between different ways of understanding the land and humanity's place within it. As tensions in the territory escalated, Jake found himself caught between William, a ruthless cattle baron from Fort Worth who was buying up water rights, and the desperate homesteaders trying to survive the increasingly unpredictable weather. The pendant grew warm against his chest whenever William's men approached, as if warning him of the greed that drove them to dam streams and redirect water from smaller farms. Sarah, a determined young widow struggling to keep her small farm near Silver City, became Jake's unexpected ally. She noticed how the rains seemed to follow his visits, how her withering crops would mysteriously revive after he passed through. While others whispered about his uncanny connection to the weather, Sarah recognized something deeper, a wisdom that transcended the usual battles over land and resources. One sweltering afternoon, William arrived at Jake's modest cabin with an offer that made the pendant burn like hot coal. The cattle baron wanted to hire Jake as his personal weather consultant, promising wealth beyond measure if he could guarantee rain for William's vast ranches while leaving competing properties to wither. The magic within Jake recoiled at the very suggestion of such manipulation. Thomas, an aging settler who'd befriended the local Navajo years before, warned Jake about similar attempts to control the region's resources in the past. He spoke of ancient conflicts that had ended in tragedy when people tried to harness natural forces for personal gain. The weather magic, Thomas explained, had always sought balance, not dominance. As summer wore on, a group of desperate farmers led by James threatened to dynamite William's largest dam near Tombstone. Jake could feel the weather responding to the rising tensions, dark clouds gathering, winds turning volatile. He knew he had to find a way to prevent violence before nature itself responded with devastating force. Catherine, the local schoolteacher, began documenting strange weather patterns in her journal, drawing connections between community conflicts and atmospheric disturbances. Her observations helped Jake understand how the magic operated on a broader scale, reflecting not just individual actions but the collective state of human relationships throughout the territory. In Abilene, where Jake traveled seeking answers about the pendant's origins, he encountered Elizabeth, an elderly woman who recognized the ancient symbols carved into its surface. She shared stories passed down through generations about weather workers who had once helped maintain peace between different peoples by demonstrating how their fates were interconnected through the natural world. The pendant's power grew stronger as Jake learned to read its subtle messages. When water disputes threatened to turn violent, it would pulse with warning energy. During moments of cooperation between ranchers and farmers, it hummed with gentle warmth. Jake began organizing meetings where all parties could witness how their actions directly affected the weather patterns that determined everyone's survival. William's influence continued to expand, though, and his men started intimidating anyone who attended Jake's gatherings. The cattle baron's empire was built on the belief that nature could be controlled and commodified, a philosophy that struck at the heart of everything the weather magic represented. Jake knew a confrontation was inevitable, but the magic seemed to be preparing him for something more complex than a simple showdown. Emma, a young Navajo woman who had inherited some of her people's weather wisdom, recognized Jake's struggle. She explained that the magic wouldn't let him simply overpower William. That would only perpetuate the cycle of dominance and resistance. Instead, she suggested, the pendant was showing him how to reveal the consequences of actions in ways that even the most hardened hearts couldn't ignore. As autumn approached, the territory teetered on the edge of conflict. William's dams had disrupted natural water flows, causing flooding in some areas and drought in others. The weather magic responded with increasingly dramatic signs: circular rainbows, clouds that moved against the wind, lightning that danced across clear skies. Jake realized he would have to risk everything to help people understand the true nature of power before their battles destroyed the very land they were fighting to control. The storm clouds gathered ominously over Silver City as Jake Johnson stood on his porch, feeling the ancient turquoise pendant throb against his chest. The Navajo weather magic he'd inherited from the elder he saved was warning him of something far worse than the usual summer squalls. His weathered hands gripped the railing as he watched William Davis and his gang of land grabbers riding toward town, their intentions as dark as the roiling sky above. Sarah Miller hurried across the muddy street, her long skirts gathered up as she made her way to Jake's homestead. As the town's only doctor, she had witnessed firsthand how Jake's mysterious abilities had helped the community through devastating droughts and floods. But she also knew that William Davis had discovered the source of Jake's power and would stop at nothing to possess it. The pendant's warmth intensified as Jake remembered the sacred cave where the elder had performed the ritual, passing on the ancient knowledge that had been in his people's keeping for generations. The transfer wasn't meant for outsiders, but the elder had seen something in Jake's soul that transcended the boundaries between their worlds. Now, that trust would be tested as never before. William Davis dismounted in front of the saloon, his boots leaving deep impressions in the rain-softened earth. His brother Thomas flanked him, both men carrying rifles and wearing expressions that promised violence. They'd already forced 3 families off their land by manipulating territorial boundaries and claiming water rights. But Jake's ability to control the weather had thwarted their plans to drive out the remaining settlers through drought. "You can't keep this up forever, Johnson," William called out, his voice carrying across the tense silence that had fallen over the street. "That magic belongs to the territory, and I've got papers from Fort Worth saying I'm the rightful administrator of all native artifacts." He pulled out a roll of documents, waving them like a battle flag. The other townsfolk watched from behind shuttered windows, knowing this confrontation had been brewing since spring. Jake felt the familiar tingling in his fingers as the sky darkened further. The pendant's power flowed through him, but he knew using it against other men would violate the sacred trust the elder had placed in him. Sarah stood beside him now, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "There's another way," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the approaching Davis brothers. Elizabeth Wilson, the town's schoolteacher, emerged from her classroom with an ancient ledger clutched to her chest. She had spent months researching territorial laws and native rights, working in secret to build a case against the Davis brothers' land schemes. The timing of her appearance wasn't coincidental. She and Sarah had planned this moment carefully. Thunder rolled across the valley as Elizabeth spoke, her voice clear and steady. "These documents prove that William Davis has been forging land titles and bribing officials in Tombstone." She held up papers bearing the territorial governor's seal. "The real administrator of native artifacts is James Thompson, who's riding here from Abilene with federal marshals." William's face contorted with rage as he raised his rifle, but Jake had already begun the weather song the elder had taught him. The wind rose suddenly, howling through the street with supernatural force. The Davis brothers struggled to maintain their footing as their carefully orchestrated plan unraveled in the face of both natural and human justice. The pendant pulsed with ancient power as Jake wove weather and wisdom together, creating not a destructive storm, but a cleansing rain that would nourish the land and wash away the corruption that had plagued Silver City. Thomas Davis dropped his rifle, raising his hands in surrender, but William refused to accept defeat. In the chaos of wind and rain, William managed to fire a single shot. The bullet struck the pendant, shattering the turquoise stone. But instead of destroying the magic, the breaking of the pendant released its power into the land itself, fulfilling an ancient prophecy the elder had whispered to Jake about the day when the sky's power would return to the earth. The storm reached its crescendo as James Thompson and his marshals rode into town, their arrival perfectly timed with nature's fury. William Davis found himself surrounded, his schemes exposed, and his power broken. The land dispute that had threatened to tear Silver City apart had become the catalyst for something far more profound: the reunion of ancient magic with the territory it had always protected. As the storm subsided, Jake realized that losing the pendant hadn't diminished his connection to the weather magic. The elder's final lesson became clear. The power had never been in the turquoise stone, but in the land itself and in the hearts of those who loved it enough to protect it. Sarah's fingers intertwined with his as they watched the marshals lead the Davis brothers away. The sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light over Silver City's rain-washed streets. Elizabeth Wilson gathered her precious documents, proof that justice could be found in both human law and natural order. The townsfolk emerged from their shelters, understanding that they had witnessed something that transcended the usual conflicts of the frontier. Jake looked out over the glistening landscape, seeing it through new eyes. The Elder's gift hadn't just been the weather magic. It had been the wisdom to understand that true power lay in using abilities for the good of all, not for personal gain. The land dispute had been settled, but the legacy of the ancient weather magic would continue, woven into the very fabric of the territory itself. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Jake and Sarah made their way to the outskirts of Silver City, where the ancient burial grounds lay untouched by the recent turmoil. The air crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the approaching storm. The land itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if aware that a pivotal moment was at hand. Jake could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that his next decision would affect not just his own fate, but the destiny of the entire territory. Elizabeth Wilson's legal victory had secured the immediate future of the disputed lands, but Jake understood that paper laws alone couldn't protect the sacred connection between the people and their homeland. The Davis brothers' attempt to exploit the weather magic had awakened something deeper, something that demanded resolution beyond human courts. As if in response to his thoughts, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and rain-soaked earth. Sarah's hand tightened on his arm as they approached the circle of standing stones that marked the boundary between the mundane world and something far more ancient. The Elder's teachings echoed in Jake's mind. Power flowed like water, finding its own level, seeking balance. The storm building overhead mirrored the tension in his heart. The knowledge that to truly become guardian of this power, he would have to prove himself worthy in ways no settler had before. From the shadow of the largest stone emerged William, the most respected medicine man among the local tribes. His weathered face bore the same gentle wisdom Jake remembered from the elder he'd saved from the flood. "The spirits have watched you," William said, his voice carrying despite the rising wind. "They have seen how you used their gift, not for personal gain, but for the protection of all." Behind them, the townsfolk gathered at a respectful distance, led by Elizabeth and Mary. Even the most skeptical among them had witnessed enough in recent days to silence their doubts. The air grew thick with anticipation as William began a slow chant, his words weaving together English and his native tongue in a melody that seemed to resonate with the very rocks beneath their feet. Thunder cracked overhead as Jake stepped forward, accepting the ceremonial blanket William offered. The pattern woven into its fabric told the story of rain and wind, of growth and harvest, of the eternal dance between earth and sky. Sarah watched with tears in her eyes, understanding that this moment would forever change not just Jake, but their shared future. The ceremony that followed transcended the boundaries between cultures, between the physical and spiritual realms. As William guided Jake through the ancient rites, the storm above them moved in perfect synchronization with their movements. The gathered witnesses gasped as rain fell in a perfect circle around the sacred space, while they remained dry within its boundaries. When the final words were spoken and the last ritual completed, Jake felt the change settle into his bones. The weather magic had evolved, becoming something neither purely native nor settler, but a bridge between worlds. He understood now why the Elder had chosen him, not because he was special, but because he was willing to stand between traditions, to honor both while serving something greater than either. Sarah joined him in the circle, and William blessed their union as guardians of the territory's natural balance. The storm above dispersed into a gentle rain that blessed the land without flooding it, a testament to the harmony that could exist between human need and nature's power. The townsfolk began to disperse, each carrying with them a new understanding of their place in the greater order of things. As twilight settled over Silver City, Jake and Sarah stood together on the high ridge overlooking the valley. Below them, lights twinkled in windows, and the sound of celebration drifted up from the town. The land dispute that had brought them to this point seemed distant now, transformed into something far more meaningful, a new covenant between the people and the land they called home. Elizabeth approached them one last time, carrying a document that would establish a new kind of protection for the sacred lands. "This will ensure that what happened with the Davis brothers can never happen again," she said, her legal mind having found a way to bridge human law with spiritual tradition. "The territory will recognize the land as a protected trust, governed by both written law and ancient custom." Jake nodded, feeling the rightness of this solution settle into place like the final piece of a complex puzzle. The weather magic had never been meant for one person's control. It was a responsibility to be shared, a trust to be maintained for future generations. As night fell over Silver City, the stars emerged in a clear sky, their light reflecting off the rain-washed earth like countless tiny mirrors, each one holding a fragment of the truth they had all discovered together. The storm clouds finally broke after 3 days of relentless rain, revealing a transformed landscape around Silver City. Jake Miller stood on his porch beside the elderly Navajo man known as Walking Thunder, both of them surveying the damage done to the valley. Fields lay submerged beneath muddy water, fences had been washed away, and the usually placid creek had become a raging torrent that carved new channels through the earth. Catherine Wilson approached on horseback, her face drawn with concern as she dismounted near Jake's homestead. "The Tombstone ranch is completely flooded out," she reported grimly. "William and his family had to abandon everything and head for higher ground. They're sheltering at the mission now with several other families." Walking Thunder raised his weathered hands toward the sky, speaking softly in his native tongue. Jake had learned enough Navajo over the past months to understand he was giving thanks that the rains had finally ceased. The old medicine man's presence had changed everything. Not just Jake's understanding of the weather, but the very fabric of life in this disputed borderland. Samuel Davis rode up next, his horse's hooves splashing through puddles. "The Territorial Marshal's office in Tombstone finally responded to our telegrams," he announced. "They're sending representatives to assess the situation. But with all the washouts on the roads, it could be days before they arrive. We need to handle things ourselves for now." Jake felt the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. Since rescuing Walking Thunder from that first flash flood months ago, he had become more than just another homesteader. The old man's teachings about reading weather signs and working with natural forces had given Jake a unique position in the community, one that bridged the divide between settlers and natives. The Navajo weather songs predicted this would be a season of great change, Walking Thunder said in his careful English. But change brings opportunity for those wise enough to see it. The waters have erased many of the artificial boundaries men have drawn upon the earth. Now we must decide how to redraw them. Together this time. James Thompson rode in from the direction of town, leading a string of pack horses loaded with supplies. "Fort Worth sent what they could spare," he called out. "Not much, but it's something. The railroads washed out in 3 places between here and Abilene, so we're mostly on our own until repairs are made." Elizabeth Miller, Jake's wife, emerged from the house with coffee and cornbread for the gathered neighbors. She had been skeptical at first about harboring a Navajo elder, but Walking Thunder's gentle wisdom and Jake's transformation under his guidance had won her over. Now she was one of the strongest voices for cooperation between the communities. The old medicine man had taught Jake that weather magic wasn't about controlling the elements. It was about understanding them, working with them, and helping others prepare for their cycles. This knowledge had already saved lives during the storms. Now it would be crucial in rebuilding and reimagining how settlers and natives could share this challenging land. Mary Davis spoke up from where she sat on the porch steps. "The tribal council sent word. They're offering to share their higher pastures with those who lost grazing land in the floods. They say it's time to return to the old ways of sharing resources according to need." The suggestion would have been unthinkable just months ago. Sarah Thompson, who had arrived with her husband James, nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe this flood was a blessing in disguise. We've all been so caught up in marking boundaries and claiming exclusive rights. But nature doesn't recognize our property lines. Perhaps we need to learn from that." Walking Thunder placed his hand on Jake's shoulder. "You have carried the knowledge I shared with honor," he said. "Now you must help carry these communities forward on a new path. The old ways and the new ways can flow together, like streams joining to form a stronger river." The group spent the remainder of the day planning how to coordinate relief efforts between the settlements and tribal lands. Jake found himself naturally falling into the role of mediator, translating not just language but perspectives between the different cultures. The flash flood that had brought Walking Thunder into his life had washed away more than just physical boundaries. As evening approached, riders arrived from both Silver City and the Navajo settlements, bringing news of conditions and offers of assistance. The territorial dispute that had dominated local politics for years was being transformed by necessity and a new spirit of cooperation, guided by ancient wisdom about living in harmony with the land. Emma Wilson arrived with a group of women from town, bringing food and medical supplies. "The trading post is organizing shelter for anyone who needs it," she reported. and the tribal healers have offered to share their knowledge of local medicinal plants to help prevent sickness from the floodwaters. Jake watched the sunset paint the storm clouds in brilliant colors, remembering the day he had found Walking Thunder clinging to a tree in the flooded wash. The old man had later told him it was no accident. The spirits had guided their meeting. Now, seeing the communities coming together in the face of disaster, Jake understood the truth of those words. Thomas Miller, Jake's younger brother, rode in just before dark with news from the outlying ranches. The stories he brought were not just of destruction, but of neighbors helping neighbors regardless of background. The invisible lines that had divided the territory were being replaced by bonds of mutual aid and understanding. As night fell, Walking Thunder led the gathered people in a traditional blessing ceremony. Settler and native voices joined together under the stars, marking the beginning of a new chapter in the territory's history. The weather magic that had brought them together was teaching them all a deeper wisdom about living on the land. Jake and Elizabeth hosted an impromptu council meeting in their home that evening, where plans were made for sharing resources and rebuilding in ways that would benefit everyone. The old disputes over land seemed petty now, replaced by a recognition that survival in this harsh territory required cooperation rather than competition. Walking Thunder's presence had catalyzed a transformation that went far beyond weather wisdom. He had shown them a different way of seeing the land, not as something to be owned and divided, but as a living force to be respected and shared. The flash flood that had threatened to destroy them had instead washed away the barriers between their hearts. As the meeting concluded, Jake stepped outside with Walking Thunder to check the night sky for weather signs. The old man smiled, pointing to a particular pattern of stars. "The storms have passed," he said, "but the real change is just beginning. You will help them find the way forward, Thunderchild." It was the first time he had used Jake's new spiritual name. The name carried both honor and obligation. Jake knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance from those who clung to the old ways of division and conflict. But the seeds of change had been planted, watered by the flood and nurtured by ancient wisdom. A new way of living on the frontier was taking root. As spring turned to summer, word of Jake's unique role as keeper of the ancient weather wisdom spread through the territories. Settlers who had once viewed the Navajo with suspicion now sought their counsel, particularly as drought threatened the region. In Silver City, even hardened ranchers like Thomas began incorporating indigenous planting techniques into their operations, guided by the knowledge Jake had learned from Walking Thunder. The changes weren't without opposition. A group of land speculators from Fort Worth, led by a ruthless businessman named William, arrived with plans to dam the creek that sustained both settler farms and Navajo grazing lands. They waved official-looking documents and spoke of progress, but Jake recognized the familiar pattern of greed disguised as development. Under a scorching August sky, Jake stood before the Territorial Council in Abilene, Walking Thunder's teachings echoing in his mind. He spoke not of ownership but of stewardship, demonstrating how the ancient weather patterns demanded free-flowing waterways. The old medicine had shown him visions of what would happen if the natural cycles were disrupted. Not just floods and drought, but a deeper wounding of the land itself. Sarah, whose homestead had nearly been lost in the flood that first brought Jake and Walking Thunder together, testified about how indigenous farming methods had doubled her yields. Her voice carried weight. She was known as one of the most successful farmers in the territory. "The old ways and the new can work together," she declared, her words carrying across the packed courthouse. In Silver City, Catherine and Emma organized meetings between settler women and Navajo weavers, sharing techniques for surviving the harsh frontier conditions. The gatherings began with practical concerns, but evolved into something deeper, a genuine cultural exchange that helped heal generations of mistrust. Jake observed these changes with quiet satisfaction, remembering Walking Thunder's words about the real storm being in people's hearts. The land speculators didn't leave quietly. William hired gunmen to intimidate farmers who opposed the dam, but the community stood united. When a mysterious series of storms repeatedly washed out their construction equipment, local rumors spoke of Jake's weather magic. He neither confirmed nor denied these tales, though the slight smile he shared with Walking Thunder spoke volumes. By harvest time, the territorial governor had declared the creek and surrounding lands a protected watershed, citing the unique partnership between settlers and Navajo as a model for future development. Jake's weather wisdom had proven that the frontier's future lay not in conquest, but in cooperation. just as the old medicine had foretold.